So I flipped the model on its head and I'm like, let me go back to my pool boy days. Let's build a product for the swimming pool market, sell to wealthier pool owners at a higher
Yep.
price point, and then reinvest those dollars to actually build out the technology into these markets that I want to get into, which is agriculture, drinking water, food and beverage.
Welcome to Everyday Innovation, your go-to podcast for enhancing your creative and entrepreneurial process. I'm Jordan DeVecchia, a multi-passionate creator entrepreneur, venture studio co-founder, and business designer and advisor. Here we live at the intersection of creativity, strategy, and personal development. Join me for inspiring conversations, actionable practices, and insight infusions designed to shift your mindset and empower you with tools and resources to create impactful ventures. Get ready to take your ideas to the next level and innovate with purpose. Welcome back to the Everyday Innovation Podcast. Today, I'm excited to have Ravi Kurani, founder of Sutro, a smart water and pool monitoring system that's been acquired. Congratulations. Ravi's a social impact innovator, advocate, investor, mentor, and podcast host of Liquid Assets. He's been building a remarkable ecosystem centered on water data and sustainability. I'm thrilled to explore his journey, his process, and the meaningful work he's doing. So, Ravi, are you ready for some warm-up questions?
I'm ready. Yeah, let's jump in.
Awesome. Okay, so we're always on this self-development journey as founders. So I'm curious as to what are you reading or what are you learning about right now?
You know what I've really gotten into is actually sci-fi, and
Ooh,
mostly
nice.
because it allows you to explore realities that otherwise, like don't exist. And so it's kind of like right now I'm reading Armada, for example.
Nice.
And in that, just in particular, they have, just this, you start to see technologies that are built that otherwise wouldn't exist. And I
Yeah.
think it really draws kind of that line between what is, A to Z of like what the world could look like. And when you kind of rewind the tape back as you're developing things yourself, you might take inspiration from things you see in sci-fi.
I feel like fiction is so important to read as instead of just reading a bunch of business books and self-help books, whatever,
Mhm.
having that different realm that you can experience. But sci-fi is so cool because it still has a bit of that technical element and
Yeah.
inspirational element. So are you mainly consuming books? Are you watching anything?
Mainly consuming books. I like
Yeah.
to kind of read, funnily enough, I like to read like sci-fi before I fall asleep because it's kind of
Oh.
a nice like detachment from the day. It's kind of,
Mhm.
usually it's some of them are pretty hard to read, but like overall, I try to pick the ones that are easier to read. And in the morning, actually, when I wake up, I'll try to read something that's like a little more philosophical. And so that kind of
Yeah.
like kicks my day off with a little bit more of a thought that's a bit more meditative, or a book that's a bit more meditative versus something at night that kind of gets my dreams to go wild.
That I was about to say, it's probably kickstarts your dreams, and I love taking the philosophy in the morning or some sort of reflective piece that you can carry throughout the day. Sometimes it, like, sets the tone for your day. Do you have any favorite books? I know a lot of people read, like, The Daily Stoic.
Yeah, I do like Ryan Holiday's Daily Stoic. I've actually tried to go back to like first principles and like read the text themselves. And
Yes.
so I'm like right now, Sun Tzu's The Art of War is like it's
Mhm.
kind of difficult to read, but like if you read the interpretations alongside the actual book,
Yeah.
it's really good. I'm reading Marshall McLuhan's book on the medium is the message, I think is what it's called, or that's maybe
Yeah.
like the summary of what he's talking about. And then the third one that I kind of cycle in and out is just, I read like Walden or Thoreau or um, any sort of like Kant or Jung, any of
Yeah.
like the weird like philosophical stuff that came about in like the 1800s.
I love it. I love it. That's great. It's such a it's you're kind of like almost giving a little hint into your morning and evening routine, like to set the tone for your sleep and when you're waking up and working, doing your thing. I have a surprise question for you. So I have some cards
Mhm.
right here. I'm gonna have like four that are prepared. So I'm just gonna kind of cycle through them, see what we get. Actually, this is pretty good. I got if you could go back in time, what would you tell your younger self? So this could be early stage founder Robbie, it could be young Robbie, whatever you feel is appropriate.
I would tell myself to not think so highly of myself, I guess would be like
Mm,
it, like to like decrease your ego in a
yeah.
certain sense. Probably another way to say that. And that's mostly because I think we take ourselves way too seriously all the time. And like a lot of innovation and like learning comes from just one, not being overly serious. And secondly, once you're not serious, you end up becoming in a mind of learning, right? If you look at like little children, like toddlers playing,
Yes.
they don't think of themselves as, these big people in the world. And everything is like exciting. Everything is like a wow to them. And I think that happens when your ego basically turns down to zero, and you can start to see wow and wonder in the world with just even the small things that you're doing. And so that's one thing I would tell myself when, you know, 10 years, 20 years ago.
No, it's so true. The ego can be a hindrance, and it can cause a lot of limiting beliefs about what you can and can't do. It causes a lot of blind spots. And I have a toddler, so I totally understand. I totally understand the perspective. It really has shifted the way that I operate as a founder as well. So, as you were getting into the sort of founder space, you are the founder of Sutro, which has grown over the years. And I'm sure everyone has asked you what your inspiration was behind that. But I love the whole chicken and egg concept. Was there like a problem that you were solving and the product was Sutro? Was it a concept or some technology or a system that you were working on and then it ended up becoming productized? I always like asking that question to see kind of where it got started and what was your MVP.
Yeah, the origin story actually starts off with me in sunny Southern California as a pool boy, actually. And
That's
my dad
incredible.
used to own a chain of pool and spa supply stores. So I like literally grew up, my high school job was being a pool boy, right? I would like work at my dad's pool store, install pumps, filters, run acid washes, test people's water.
Mhm.
And so through that kind of upbringing, I ended up going and getting an engineering degree from UC Riverside. Fast forwarding to actually when I was an associate at a venture capital fund in India, we looked at a lot of deals. And the big problem that kept on popping up was a lot of companies or organizations were working on water filtration, but nobody
Mhm.
was working
Mhm.
on water sensing. Like they were trying to fix the water, but they didn't know what was wrong with it. And
Right.
so we're kind of like, well, how do we know what's wrong with it? And what does the market of sensors look like? And you know, my kind of pool boy days flashed before my eyes, and I'm like, we did water testing. We did water testing a lot in the pool store
Yeah.
because you need to know your chlorine content, your pH. And I'm like, what if we make a better water sensor? And so we tried to design the water sensor and sell it into the Indian government. Didn't work. Probably the stupidest idea a startup can have, because selling to governments are just very, very tough. There's a lot of
Yeah.
people to work with. There's a lot of red tape. And so I flipped the model on its head, and I'm like, let me go back to my pool boy days. Let's build a product for the swimming pool market, sell to wealthier pool owners at a higher
Yep.
price point, and then reinvest those dollars to actually build out the technology into these markets that I want to get into, which is agriculture, drinking water, food and beverage.
That's incredible, and I love that you have this story where you're hitting a pain point probably for yourself as a pool boy and also for people who are trying to maintain their pools, and it's just like it's either you have to run to the store and get a new testing kit or you have to test it on this day or, "Oh, no, the kids wanna swim today and now I have to I don't know if I, like, have checked up on it in a little while, and I don't want that to be an issue." When you're developing this out with the customer in mind, or maybe were you also thinking maybe about pool companies as well? Probably not so much because they would have to be leaving the devices there, right? So you're kind of developing that sort of ICP of the wealthy pool customer. How did you go about finding some of your maybe your first customers for that?
Yeah, and initially it's kind of funny. We actually did try to sell into industry. So we had an entire business plan around swimming pool stores
Huh?
and actually pool boys, like pool service technicians. And in selling into those two markets, well, two things ended up happening. The first, that was actually the biggest black swan, which was COVID.
Mm.
And so we had this big B2B plan that we were going to go in through distribution, and COVID basically shut the doors of most businesses. And
Yep.
so within weeks of us actually launching, we had to pivot our entire model to go direct to consumer, go B2C, go online. And in fact, it was actually a boon for our business because everybody was stuck at home. All the businesses were
Mhm.
closed. You had your swimming pool in your backyard. You couldn't call a pool guy, nor could you go to a pool store. And
Mhm.
so you immediately went online and you searched for, water monitoring robot or pool guy in my pool, whatever it is. A little bit like aggressive, way more aggressive than we initially had planned, but
Mhm.
we were able to kind of, pull up our pants and like run as fast as we can in 2020 when COVID hit. And fast forward 3 years, we have now, kind of, we're still in B2C, but we're opening up more channels around the commercial side of things, because there is regulation if you have a commercial swimming pool that you have to measure water chemistry for the safety of the swimmers. And also a lot more people are going back to pool stores, and a lot more pool service technicians are out there. And so that's kind of how the business model ended up evolving around our ICP.
I feel like that COVID was really one of those things that was pulling a lot of focus into that consumer market, and people starting to pay a lot more attention to their home care, their own health care, anything where it's like, I need to start getting some data on some stuff and make some good
Mhm.
decisions, because now I have the time to like look at it and to care about it and to put time into it. And like you said, you just have to be willing to pivot and, like you said, pull your pants up and run, like, to serve them. So what was like version 1 Sutro, and you started kind of selling it to you, or was it fairly similar to what you have now?
Yeah, version 1 Sutro, very, very interesting question. We actually, again, went back to the pool boy roots. We had this one assumption of, will people actually value a robot in their swimming pool, and can they detach themselves from this reactive behavior that you said, right? Going out to your swimming pool, you have to remember when to go test your water. This
Right.
flips that relationship around, because now it's turning something that was reactive into something that's preventative. The robot's always testing, and then it tells you what your chemistry is and what to do and when to do it. And so that was kind of our biggest assumption. I was like, are people going to like something that's preventative, or do they really enjoy this sort of reactive behavior? Is there something that we're not seeing in there? And so in order to validate that, we actually ended up making mock sutros before we even had built out the technology, and we just dropped in their swimming pool as like a decoy, as a proxy. And we said,
Yeah.
look, you are just going to let this thing test your pool. We're going to come by every single week and basically validate whether or not the unit is testing the way that it should, as kind of a QA check, right? We're going to kind of quality assurance for the device. Meanwhile, we were actually just testing the water. That's honestly what
Yeah.
we were doing. We were
Yeah.
going back and, like, we didn't even have an app yet. We were actually texting people, hey, your chlorine's high, your pH is high, put in this chemicals, text back done when done. And obviously there's kind of a Wizard of Oz, or somebody behind the curtains.
Right. Of course, there's
Um,
like a little bit of automation, a little bit of like, yeah, it's like the customer service early on most companies. It's like the
yeah,
founder just like, hi, this is the customer service technician. And it's just you.
exactly. And so we were able to validate, and we ended up growing actually to like 30 pools, just using that method.
Oh, I love
And then we started getting into like selling chemicals, and like we basically proved out the entire business model before we kind of spent our first dollar on actually even developing technology. We did have our prototypes from India, the work that we did, but like we didn't start retrofitting it for the swimming pool industry, outside of validating whether or not the customers would pay for something like this. And so that's kind of how we initially got out the building. I'm a big fan of concierging experiences, right? Doing the Wizard of
that. Mhm.
Oz sort of dance in the back in order to
Yes.
validate whether or not there is a there for your customers. And so that's kind of what the first MVP actually looked like.
And I feel like a lot of really successful companies have done this as well, because they are validating, or they are getting so much feedback in the beginning that they can
Mhm.
actually implement that right away, as opposed to if you spend all this time, all this planning, all this money, you get something, especially with physical, anything that has like a physical product that you can't just change overnight with code. You know, to get that physical product and there's like some issues with it, it's a very easy fix if you're able to ask them ahead of time. And most people don't care. They just want it done for them. So it's like, if you're like, they're not going to be like, oh, I'd like to see like the exact like algorithm that you're using. No, it's like you're using like human intelligence. That's okay in the
Exactly.
beginning. So what did you find out? Like, what did you find out from some of these people when they were testing it? Was it helping them? Did you find any pain points that maybe you didn't think that you would have? Was there like a surprise there or anything that maybe you didn't expect?
Yeah, there's kind of a few things. First is when we finished up the trial, I think we did a trial for like 10 weeks or 15 weeks, something like that. When
Mhm.
we took these devices away, these users were like, what do you want us to do? We've grown dependent on this thing. And that was my first sign of like, interesting. Okay, I think we're like onto something, because when you pull this, it's already become such of their work stream, such of their like livelihood when they come home, on depending on this thing for their clean water, that
Yeah.
when I'm taking it away, they're extremely disappointed. Which is kind of the first point. The second one is actually, we had thought that your typical dad in the family was the one that was actually, from like an ICP perspective, was the one out in the
Right.
swimming pool.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, it was the kids that were testing the swimming pool.
Oh, I love
Or
that. That's
or
so
like the
cool.
neighbor. Sometimes there was very like disparate people that we otherwise wouldn't have thought were actually testing and treating the swimming pool
Yeah.
who were going out there. And so it kind of helped us in building the architecture to make sure that you can actually share logins with people. Whereas initially we wouldn't have designed something that way.
And so from that point, like as you started to scale it, it was like a lot of D2C. So you were selling primarily online, or did you go to like some shows? Like how did that work, especially like in that post COVID era? Was it just a lot of online marketing? How did that work?
It was actually entirely online because we ended up launching right on literally like I think 2 weeks before COVID hit. And so
Oh, okay.
there
Yeah.
was no trade shows. Everything was
Yeah.
closed. And so
Everything was closed. Yeah.
we had one channel that was Google and Facebook, right? That was online marketing. And so we just really had to tell the story to as much as we could through our e-commerce store, through Shopify, through Google, through Facebook, through ads, and just through email marketing. Like we went 110% digital and
Yeah.
closed everything on the sales side.
And really, I think a lot of Shopify stores did great, and they did a great job of like making sure people were notified in tracking because everyone is sitting
Mhm.
at home watching their tracker to make sure that their product gets there on time and they're waiting for all their things, you know. So these platforms I know were incredibly helpful for D2C during this time, and they really were listening to their people. So did you get a lot of like referrals too? Were people like telling their friend? Did you get like a
Mhm.
lot of people telling their friends about it and spreading it that way? And then how did that kind of now start to like balloon into growth?
We really learned the power of like social, even like organic social, of how
Mhm.
people would take pictures of it. You know, it's funny because the product is kind of I hate to say it, but it's kind of like a boring necessary product. Like it's a pool tester. And so there's not necessarily too much to take photos of there or like post, you know, you can't take a screenshot of your Sutro screen like you would take a picture of your Strava bike ride, right?
Oh,
That's like
right. Yes.
something that I
Yeah.
want. Like I've just done a 10-mile bike ride and I post a picture of it on Facebook or Instagram, but your swimming pool chemistry, like nobody really cares. Although people do find value in and beauty in their backyards, right? And so we were kind of like, how do we exist in the backyard, exist in this beautiful body of water, but also not overtake, you know, people these like big duckies and things. Like we also didn't want to
Yes.
be too kitschy and too like weird. And so we ended up kind of making the device. If you look at the industrial design, it's extremely sleek. It's like meant to
It
be in that
is.
kind of upper echelon of
Yes.
pool owners that have beautiful backyards and don't mind this like beautiful thing floating in there.
Yeah, and it probably garners a lot of questions, you know, from people too, or if they're inviting people over to swim, they're like, "What is that? That looks so interesting." And it's not just like, "Oh, this is what dumping chlorine in the pool," whatever, you know, the
Yeah.
old like old school chlorine things that my dog used to actually like take out and go throw around the yard. It was like because I grew up in Miami, big pool city, but you know, being able to see that and it's like, wait, it's actually like a smart device.
Mhm.
That's pretty cool. How did people start to interact with like the app? Did you find that was that easier, harder to get people to adopt, or did you get some feedback that was really helpful as you were growing? Because IoT is so cool because you're able to
Mhm.
like take this physical product and then like also merge it with the world of digital UX and everything.
Yeah, it's honestly really tough. So anybody that's building hardware out there, hardware is hard because not only are you building a software product, but you're literally probably 10 to 100xing the difficulty on what it is to build a software product, which is hardware. And
Yeah.
so, you know, you have a really big insurmountable kind of hill to climb.
Yeah.
Um, and kind of managing that obviously becomes the tact of a founder that's building a hardware company. When we kind of focus and spotlight on the software side, it's honestly where the hardware shines, right? The hardware is nothing but kind of a means to an end to access your data on the app. That's like basically why you buy the hardware. You're not really doing much with the Sutro outside of setting it up and putting it in your swimming pool. Going back to that first point that I said around when we took away the device and somebody was like, I'm like super disappointed now that you had actually taken this away. We I really leaned on this thing called the PMF, or the product market fit survey, by the founder of Superhuman, the basically the email company.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because the first question on there is, if we were to take Sutro away from you, how disappointed would you be? Very disappointed, somewhat disappointed, or not disappointed? And it goes back full loop to that MVP conversation we had when that guy was like, I'm so disappointed you're taking this away from me. He
Yeah.
would be very disappointed. And what you're able to do with this PMF survey is actually segment data based off of when people first buy the device. We send the survey out, and
Yeah.
people have to answer like, would you be very, not, or somewhat disappointed? And how could we make it better? What can we change? We have a few other sub questions underneath there. But when you take that full data set and then you segregate against the not disappointed, somewhat, and very, you start to really see the feedback that you actually need to focus on. And so to directly answer your question, that's how we actually actively track feedback on the app and then what we should actually be developing from a software standpoint.
That's so smart, and that's a really great resource. I'm definitely going to link that, like, in the show notes and our little companion. I do a little companion guide as well. We'll talk about that later, but it's kind of to encapsulate some of the wisdom that we're talking about and take it outside of the podcast itself. But that Superhuman's incredible anyway. But the product market fit, that's really really intelligent, and being able, that's a pretty accessible way to collect data from people instead of there's a lot of really complicated, I'm sure you've come across a lot of
Yeah,
complicated software to like see how people are using apps and everything, and really it's a lot more simple, I think, than that. It's a lot more just about just their user behavior, and yes, like you said, are you going to miss this or are you not? Like, there's so many apps out there that if you I think they've deleted themselves off my phone, or I've deleted it and I didn't even remember that they were there, and that's pretty, that's a pretty good indicator of how much it's actually like built into my life. And you want them to miss their pool robot,
exactly.
right? So this technology, what has it opened up in this like IoT space for water? Like, where do you see it going next, really? If you're in sustainability, social impact, data in with water, how do you see that kind of expanding just beyond the experience of Sutro?
It's sad because people don't know how much water affects our daily lives. And not only just from like turning on your tap and drinking water, but the largest user of water is actually agriculture, right? A lot of the food we put on the table is serviced by water. Obviously,
Right.
you need to water the plants. And a lot of the problems that we're seeing in, like in Florida, for example, since you're from there, there was a big they call this nitrification inside the lakes, right? Like the lakes
Mhm.
turn green, and that's
Yeah.
because of many times because of fertilizer runoff. And that fertilizer runoff, if you go back to where is the fertilizer coming from, is from the farms, from like the agricultural situations. And why are people putting fertilizer in the ground is to grow the plants better. But many times in the California crops in particular, they'll do what's called like drip irrigation, and they'll actually put the fertilizer into the water. And many times farmers will just basically over fertilize because they want to make sure the plants are growing healthily. Sutro, right, to kind of directly answer your question, will or can measure the parameters of fertilizer that's going into that water, so we can basically right size the fertilizer so we don't over fertilize to have these kind of nitrification issues in lakes. That's just one example, right? The second example is you look at Flint, Michigan, here in the United States, right? We think that we have great water. We sometimes do, we sometimes don't. And if we can measure what the content or what the parameters of the water are at the distribution facility that's actually shipping the water to the homes, or even at the household level at the end point of use, um, you can fix a lot of things there, right? And I think this loop of like sense and treat, or sense and dispense,
Yes.
exists wherever water is used. And it usually needs to be treated to some aspect, whether you're in agriculture, you're drinking water, you're making wine, you're making whiskey, like all of these things require a certain quality of water.
Yep.
In a swimming pool, you need high chlorine content, but you don't want to use your chlorine water to grow your plants. And so Sutro
Exactly.
wants to exist. We should exist at all these points. You need to sense water chemistry. And that was the kind of initial vision of how and why we built the technology.
There's so many different aspects that you can use this in, and that's really really exciting. Is there anything that you're look those are those the main things that you're looking towards now, and like what is the process of doing that?
Yeah, I guess I can share that we do have it in the roadmap to obviously grow inside of the swimming pool industry at the very least, right? Through this in
Yeah.
pipe concept. We're working with chemical companies within the pool industry itself to actually figure out how we can better treat the water, so
Yeah.
we can actually complete that full loop of sense and dispense. And then I think the kind of third thing I can say is we also on the roadmap do have capacity and capability, and we are speaking to some people on how to basically expand into the food and beverage and agriculture industry. And so, probably, and that's I think about 2 years, 2.5 years out.
Mhm.
And the swimming pool stuff is probably about a year to a year and a half out. But yeah, definitely we are. it's very much within the roadmap and what we want to execute in the future.
That's awesome. How has your personal journey been, like, going from, like, early stage founder, like you said, like the Wizard of Ozing,
Mhm.
the MVP to where you are now, which is you were acquired. Maybe you can share a little bit about that and how, maybe your role has changed and, like, how you're kind of expanding your particular impact and influence into maybe some other spaces. So you are, yes, the founder, but you also have these kind of other aspects and avenues that you're exploring.
Sure. Um, yeah, there definitely has been a change, personally, and also just what the organization also requires of me.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
you're right. In the beginning, all of this kind of Wizard of Ozing, MVPing, fundraising. I mean, pitching investors up and down Sand Hill Road in San Francisco. And then we sold the company in, what was 2018, 2019.
Mhm.
Um, which was great, and I'm extremely grateful to our parent company, Sandy Mark, out of Canada,
Mhm.
because they gave us the necessary firepower to actually manufacture this. Right, we were in the middle of
Right.
kind of fundraising and manufacturing, cutting molds. I mean, these are really expensive things to do,
Yeah.
and having the backing of somebody like a Sandy Mark or like a large parent company, um, really makes it possible, and it actually allows me as a founder and somebody who has kind of envisioned this idea to actually execute it, right? I think so much time gets spent on like fundraising and raising money and making sure
Mhm.
you're dealing with all this stuff that you can now almost take a deep breath and like run and execute on the thing that you want to do,
Yeah.
versus having to like chase and splat a bunch of things everywhere.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that's one thing that was nice from like an execution perspective. What changed from like a management perspective is I'm more of a translator now, right? I have to work within the guidelines of what the parent company's vision is, which is I'm working within a larger vision set, and we're one kind of subcomponent to what they're working on. And
Right.
the second piece is at the same time that their kind of sails in the wind are changing, we also have to kind of change our side on the bottom, and then kind of looking at a cone upwards and a cone downwards, I kind of find myself in the middle, right? I have to like make sure that I'm
Yes.
guiding my team to execute given the vision of what the parent company wants. And so there's a little bit more like alignment, honestly, between what the parent company
Yeah.
wants and what we're working on.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's positives and negatives, of course, to any of those things, just because you have this, benevolent force that's there that will have its, like you said, like its vision, and you're reconciling kind of your vision with that, and then also probably the needs of your customers, which I'm sure that's going to be very unique to you, and then very unique to them too, how they want to respond to that. So that makes a whole lot of sense. And you so your acquisition was at a really interesting time because you had a lot of growth after that too, and it kind of shows, I think a lot of people think that there's this acquisition model of like things need to be doing have a certain level of success over a really long period of time and then they get acquired, but there's so many different situations where that can happen, and being open to that, I think there are a lot of founders that run themselves into the ground and don't present their idea in a way where maybe they can be open to that. That's like an early, almost like in a sense, like an early exit, even though you were still part of it. It's interesting because I think most people are hearing the story of worked on this for several years and it got big enough, and then someone bought it, when really it's like no, I solved a really good problem early.
Yeah, and I think every story is different, right? There is the
Yeah.
story that you were mentioning that people think is the like runaway acquisition story, but I think it really goes back to understanding at the stage of where you're at, what
Hmm.
problems you solve and for who and for like what organization. And I think that's just where we were like nobody had developed this sort of sensor technology. And that's kind of where we started back at from our initial origination. And
Yeah.
so when you're thinking about what's our value, we have really cool sensor tech that does stuff that nobody else has done before. And
Yeah.
that's interesting to a lot of companies. And so yeah,
Exactly.
there is many reasons that people or organizations do get acquired.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I wanted to mention, because many of the early stage founders that are here are also, I would put them into the creator entrepreneur category, where they're leveraging a lot of organic social media, using newsletters, education, other pieces to bring in their expertise and share their brand. So I know that you have a podcast called Liquid Assets. What are you doing with that? How did you decide to do that? Is it for advocacy? Are you sharing new developments? Tell us all about it, because for people who are interested in that, and we'll talk a little bit about your process too, because I love sharing, people's creative process, no matter what the topic is.
Yeah. Liquid Assets is interesting. Liquid Assets is a podcast about the intersection of technology, policy, and business, as it looks at the lens of water. And so we have a bunch of really interesting guests. And its initial impetus was off of me just wanting to explore these markets I've been talking about, right? Like not only where does Sutro fit in, but like what else is happening in the water space? That was kind of the question I was talking about.
Yeah.
And the kind of second degree question to that is, there was a bunch of content out there around water,
Right.
but if you ask the person that's walking on the sidewalk if they know any of this stuff, many times they don't. And like I didn't, and I work in the water industry. And so I was like, how do I build a stream of content or a podcast or a content network that allows the regular person to be able to access information on one of our world's most precious resources that frankly none of us know about, including me, like the guy that works in water. And so that's kind of why I initially started. I literally just opened up Riverside and I hopped on my first podcast and hit the record button. Like it wasn't good. I still listen to my first podcast episode sometimes and I'm like, that wasn't the best episode that I've ever had, but
Yeah. I mean, honestly, if you're not cringing at some of your first content, then you're not growing at all. Or there you're just like a super anomaly. But for most people, like, you're improving upon yourself. So every single time you hit record, it's a new experience. It's a way to innovate and to get better, right?
just hitting that publish button or hitting that record button. Like if you're in your head all day long and you're like strategizing and thinking about how you're going to do this podcast episode, just record it and then publish
Yeah.
it. And you're right. If you're not cringing, then you launch either too late or you're like,
Yeah.
an anomaly.
Even if you were an anomaly and you started off really great, there's still some drive to like get better. So it's probably not cringy for anyone else, but it's probably cringy for you,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And you hit on such a good point. It's not just, oh, I want to have a podcast and I want to tell everybody everything. It's a personal development tool for yourself. It's a way for you to research, to meet new people. If you're doing interviews, it's like, how I would liken, it's another form of writing, really, because
Mhm.
you're able to take your thoughts and distill them into something. I think I've come to a lot of clarity about certain things because I put it into a video form or written form or hit publish. And I think a lot of people miss out on that because it's just either stuck in your head, or you're taking it, you're thinking about it, and then you're just either putting it in a file somewhere, not really refining that idea, maybe. And I just think it's a great practice for people to, like you said, research and put things out there. And it's not just about being, I'm the thought leader on water. I mean, even though that's lovely and nice, it's very much, you're also a student as well. So
Mhm.
I really appreciate that perspective for people who maybe don't see themselves as a podcaster, don't see themselves as a writer. I think we all absolutely have that, creator side in us. So what have you noticed, as you've launched like Liquid Assets and had people on, has that given you any ideas, like, for, like you had mentioned, you kind of doing research at the same time? Has there been anything that you've taken away from the podcast you've implemented in Sutro, or maybe in some of the other like ventures and things that you've been involved in with water?
Yeah, I think a few things. The kind of two major bullet points, if I was to distill them, is one is the like US in particular. I don't, I can't speak much to like Europe or Asia or India. Um, Misuses our water. We use like fresh water for basically everything, to like flush our toilets, to like, wash our hands, like everything in the above. And there's actually a spectra of how you could use water, right? Like our plants don't need the cleanest water that we drink. Like it's actually
Right.
fine with a little bit of nutrients inside there. And so like you don't necessarily need to use what they call as black water straight out of your toilet, but like there is a way to like recycle the water, and 95% of it can actually be curbed through like water recycling methods. And I know like California in particular has now allowed it as of I think this year or year before, to actually do like water recycling in buildings. And so that's like point one. And then point two actually is that energy and energy generation is really important for making sure that one, we can generate water, and also we can like run the systems that our infrastructure needs. And so, I kind of never thought of it that way, but it's like energy is really the root of like all of society's progress. Because if we can get more energy cheaply, we can do things like power our AI models that suck up a bunch of energy.
Yes,
We can
exactly.
like desalinate and clean water because you can like run the pumps much cheaply. And so like a lot of things actually go back to this initial first principles of if you just had a cleaner, more robust energy source, you can then actually power a lot of the development and growth for society.
I totally agree. And to be honest with you, like even from a personal perspective, I know it's very different from like actual ecosystem energy, but even the way that I see life, I've learned so much personally, I think from sustainability too, in the sense of the idea of what an ecosystem is and how that applies to community building and business. Even just energy management. I'm not necessarily a time management person anymore, or I mean, yes, money and time, all those things are important. These are all resources, but the energetic standpoint of showing up for something with full energy is a totally different outcome than when you show up to something and it's, you know what I'm saying? You don't have
Yeah.
that same, you're not filling your cup first, that sort of thing, where it gets a little more into the psychology aspect of it and maybe physical aspect of it, but it's very much the same. And we mirror nature all the time. I'm sure you encounter that all the time where there's so much that's inspired by nature and design and what you're doing. I know I mentioned ecosystem. I'm sure a big part of this creator venture, liquid assets, and talking to more and different people has started a bit of community building in this space. Tell me about the networks that you're a part of and like how you're leveraging those connections to maybe either, I know you mentor some founders, you also are part of probably some groups. How have you branched into sort of that ecosystem?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the process of growing the liquid assets network a little bit, but
Mm,
more of actually what I want to talk about is I know in today's digital world people hate to hear this, but like showing up in real life, right? Like going to an event, shaking hands, like Zoom and digital meetings are great, but at the end of the day, I've we moved to New York about 6 months ago, and
mhm.
I mean there's people everywhere in New York, and there's so many networks and so many places to go to that I've just found so much value in like reconnecting with people post COVID.
Yeah,
Because we kind of gotten a little bit of this rut around, yeah, I can just do it through FaceTime or through Zoom or through Google Meet.
right.
That would kind of be like my first point. The second is I'm actually a part of, yeah, a few groups. And the one that I've actually found the most value in is one that's called Hampton. And Hampton's kind of a group of founders. They have a digital and a physical community. And it's just been great. It's been great to meet like other like-minded founders. It's kind of what we used to have back in the day with like the accelerators. And, there was like Y Combinator and
Masterminds,
Bolt and
right?
Masterminds. Yeah. And so
Yeah.
now they're just coming back in another name. And I feel like the 3 years have kind of erased our memory a little bit, and we kind of like need to learn how to walk again. And so that's what I've been doing a lot more of.
That's awesome, and it's great that you're mentioning that too, because I think that we need these spaces, especially as founders, especially for founder mental health too. I mean, man, after COVID and then before COVID, anytime like entrepreneurship is like a personal development journey and like a tough journey in general. And sometimes it's nice to talk with other people who understand that, who have been through that, maybe are at a different stage of it, or even if you've gone through something and somebody's going through a situation that you went through at a certain point and you're able to mentor them, it like makes you, you know what I mean? Even if you're going through something hard that day, it makes you feel a whole lot better to say like, oh my gosh, I was able to get someone kind of through that moment of imposter syndrome or whatever it might be, or they had a really tough rejection from, a VC or something that you're like, I'm old hat at that now. I feel like at all different levels, I feel like people just assume that you just have that when you're first starting out, but you need it forever, probably.
Entirely. Yeah.
I love that. And so you're an entrepreneur in residence. So I'm just starting a venture studio and there's these terms like entrepreneur in residence, founder in residence. There's also other roles where that shows up. So I wanted to talk about like what is that sort of a role and how do you function in that an organization as an entrepreneur in residence? Because I've also seen them for cities as well. So
Yeah. So
tell
I'm,
us
I'm
the
an
difference.
entrepreneur in residence for FCC Future Communities Capital. They're a venture fund out of California that invest in, I guess, what we can call legacy businesses, right? Like just really old, slower moving industries like
Mhm.
healthcare or smart cities. And so my kind of work there is one, exploring the water world, right? So that's kind of like my like Venn diagram with liquid assets. A lot of liquid asset stuff kind of ends up coming and bubbling up into essays and things that I can, present. And the
Right.
second is around the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So there's a lot of money that the federal government is pushing forward around infrastructure-based projects, around energy upgrades, around water,
Yes.
around our bridges, around our roads. And so I'm kind of just taking this like global look at what exactly does that mean, and what does that mean within the portfolio companies that are at FCC. And so that's kind of like the kind of two main threads that I'm working on. It's very much like a self-study sort of project. I'm FCC in particular kind of leaves me at like an arm's length distance, although I know there's EIRs that are
Right.
closer to the partners, but that's just my particular experience with what I'm working on.
Nice. Yeah, I think sometimes you see that role has kind of been, I wouldn't say it's necessarily newer, but it's maybe just functioning a little bit more newly just because
Mhm.
they're trying to bring knowledge in. So I'm always interested to see like how it actually shows up in different places because I do think there can be a lot of different definitions. That's awesome that you're able to kind of bring that knowledge and also, like you said, bring liquid assets and have this creator experience where you can work on researching some of these things and then pull it into other pieces where you can bring that knowledge to an organization. So that's a
Mhm.
really good piece of advice maybe for people who are out there who are creating content to have a podcast and a specific expertise. Hey, you never know, you might become an entrepreneur in residence somewhere and bring that expertise elsewhere if you have that experience. So speaking of different definitions, I have a couple of closing questions because I want to make sure that I respect our time. It's been an awesome conversation, but I have the title of this my whole project. So it's this the newsletter, little bit of a resource hub is called Everyday Innovation. I have many definitions for it. I like asking my guests who come on what their version of that is, what it means to you. It doesn't have to be like a strict definition. It can just be like how it shows up for you. But I want to ask you, what does everyday innovation mean to you?
It means to show up and to be aware every single day,
Yeah.
and kind of like what you were saying, right? Like showing up with your cup full, because if you're arriving at somewhere, you're not going to be able, you won't get that spark in innovation if you yourself aren't aware and drop your ego down. And so that's what I would call as an everyday innovation, kind of what we started this podcast with.
Yeah, we actually very much full circle. I love
Yeah.
that. I love that. That's a great definition. The awareness is so key too. I think we're always distracted between phones, between all the things we think we need to do, and being able to be a little bit more present allows you to see all those opportunities. Lets you be the pool boy that that sees it that sees an issue in the a little thing that they can solve a problem, right? And then the last thing is there anything that you would pose to the general community listening to this or the audience? It can be impact related, it can be relating to Sutro, it could be anything that you'd like.
I would definitely say my just one piece of advice is to hit that launch button like we were talking about. And
Yeah.
secondarily, if you want to find me, you can find me at Ravi Kurani on LinkedIn. Just shoot me a message and put Everyday Podcast in there, Everyday Innovation Podcast. I answer most all my messages. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Awesome, awesome. And then is there anywhere else like so you mentioned that you got ahead of me in sharing where we'd like to find you, but there's also Sutro. Is there any other places you'd like to plug? Liquid assets, of course, I'll put the in the show notes as well. Anywhere else? Is that LinkedIn the best for you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's the best to kind of personally contact me. But if you have a swimming pool and you want to get a Sutro, you can go to mysutro.com. And if you're
Yes.
interested in water, go to liquidassets.cc.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you and hearing about your story, talking about all things self-development and your founder journey. Really appreciate it. So thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to sharing this episode soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.